Hi, I'm John Zander from Panspending Studios and CelebrateGeek.com, and today we're proud to present independent author Alex Fedyr giving a reading from her debut novel, Estranged. If you like what you hear, you can buy the full book at bit.ly/AlexFedyr. Special thanks to Aunties Bookstore in downtown Spokane, who were kind enough to allow us to film this event in their venue.
A bit of a setup for where we're picking up in this book. So the creatures in this book are not quite zombies, they're a little bit different. You'll kind of figure out what the differences are as the story goes on. And where we pick up, the main character, Calais, she's home from work, she's kind of cleaning up the house, they're getting ready for, her nieces are coming by for a play date type thing. But this isn't a particularly good day for her, it's the anniversary of something very bad that happened. So while she's cleaning up, her mind kind of wanders back to what happened in the past. And that's where we pick up right now. They say time heals all wounds, but Calais knew better. Her wounds only festered with age. She could still remember the very first E-Day when the Estranged showed up in the city. One had arrived on their doorstep in the form of a young man, and that man had taken her life away with a hug. He was tall, with lean muscles and a smooth, strong chin, and brown hair just long enough to fall into his eyes. Even as her parents' faces faded from her adult memory, the young man's face was burned into her mind's eye. His strong, angular face with its wide, naive eyes. He had walked through the door and hugged Clay's mom, then reached out to touch her dad. It was a simple, almost friendly act, but he was estranged. And that touch, the skin of his arms on the skin of her mother's neck, the skin of his hand closed around her father's arm, that was all it took to shatter Clay's world. The young man had fallen to his knees, his hair falling forward to veil his eyes as he doubled over and sobbed over the fresh corpses. Not his friend, though. The killer had a companion, an even taller, bleach blonde man, who walked into the room with a fresh energy in his step and a grin on his face. And as he walked through the room, the blonde man kept laughing and laughing in a high-pitched shriek that made Calais want to scream. The doorbell rang, and Calais jumped, nearly dropping the glass dolphin she held in her hand. She quickly placed the decoration on the mantel and walked over to the door. "Auntie!" As Calais opened the door, Cass ran in and hugged Calais at the hip. Calais smiled and rubbed the small girl's head as she greeted her brother-in-law. "Hey, Kane, how's it going? I hear you're taking another trip." Kane was half a foot taller than his younger brother, with an identical nose. But where his brother had soft brown eyes, Kane had steely gray eyes, which always narrowed slightly as though he was repressing a great deal of stress. He sighed. "Yeah, they've got me going to Takayo this time. It could be a while. Sorry for dumping the girls on you like this." "No, not at all. It's always a pleasure to have them." Kane smiled politely and handed a sleeping Taya over to Calais. Fen came to the door, greeted a bouncing and babbling Cass, then looked up and said, "Hey brother, how's it going?" "You know, same old. Well, I'd better get going. I'm sure you guys have an exciting night ahead of you. Bye girls. Thanks again, Fen." "No problem. Have a safe flight." Taya stirred and rubbed her eyes. "Auntie?" "Yes, sweetie?" Taya's eyes flew open. "Auntie!" She flung her arms around Clay's neck, and it was all downhill from there. The girls were absolutely radiating energy, and they didn't give Fen or Calais a moment's rest as they tracked down all of their toys and demanded that their hosts play with them. Calais and Fen happily obliged, with Fen slipping away a few hours in to start making dinner. The girls were already beginning to crash by the time dinner was served, and Calais was feeling pretty worn as well. Taya was practically falling asleep on her plate, and Calais began fighting off the ghosts and anxieties that crept back in at the edges of her mind. She could even hear the blonde-haired man laughing as the memory of that night began to replay in her mind, unwilling to give her a moment's peace on this anniversary. The laughter went on, and Calais was starting to wonder if she was losing her mind when Cass said, "Auntie, who's laughing?" Calais looked at Fen, who shrugged. Realizing the laughter was real, she ran to the living room and pulled back the curtains. The blonde-haired man was standing on their lawn, laughing. He stopped when he saw Calais, his face growing with a wide grin. Terror robbed Calais of her limbs, her lungs, even her voice. She couldn't move, she couldn't think, she couldn't breathe. Fen stirred at the table behind her. "Honey, what is it?" Power rushed back along with a fresh wave of horror. "Fen, grab the girls, now." Calais didn't have time to explain. Luckily, a loud bang at the front door did it for her. Shoot, he's not alone. She pulled the curtains shut and ran to the office to retrieve her silver 9mm pistol from the safe. When she returned to the living room, Fen had Taya sitting on the couch as he wrestled with her shoe, trying to get it onto her fidgeting foot. Cass was sitting on the floor beside Fen, crying as the Estranged continued to bang at the door. Clay placed her hand on the child's shoulder and gave it a soft squeeze. Then she turned to Fen and said, "Don't worry about the shoe. Just get the girls to the car." And the window shattered as two Estranged burst into the living room. Without hesitating, Clay gave them each a bullet to the brain and told Fen, "Get the girls to the car. Go." Fen scooped up Cass and Taya and ran for the garage door, the girls screaming in his arms. A dozen more Estranged were climbing through the window, surprisingly agile and quick as they jumped through it. She shot the first four down, then ran after Fen as the rest stumbled over their comrades' bodies. She ran into the garage, slammed the door shut behind her, then grabbed a nearby stepladder and wedged it under the handle. Behind her, a small voice asked, "Auntie, are we going to die?" Calais instinctually slid her thumb along the gun and put the safety on before she turned around to see Cass staring at her with wide, terrified eyes. Calais closed her own eyes against the surge of tears the little girl's question had summoned, and then she opened them again, kneeled down to Cass's level, and said, "Everything's gonna be okay, sweetie. Don't worry." She wished she could believe it herself. Clay looked past Cass to see Fen still struggling to get a screaming Taya into the car seat. "Fen, do you need help?" "Nope, I've got it," he called back. Bang! The garage door shuddered against its rails as something crashed into it. Clay wasn't surprised they would try getting in that way. She just wished they would have taken longer to think of it. Fen pulled himself away from the back seat, shutting the door as he took out the keys and said, "Hurry up and get in. I'm driving." Clay was loath to give up control of her car, especially in a dire situation such as this, but she had to admit it was necessary. "All right, I need my hands free to shoot anyway." She scooped up Cass and rushed her over to the other side of the car. But as she did so, Cass protested. "Auntie, I can walk on my own." Cass screamed and Clay's gut jumped as the garage door crashed against the rails again. Clay glanced at the door and saw a massive influx of metal where it had been hit. She doubted it could withstand another strike like that. She turned her attention back to Cass as she opened the car door and set the girl down. "I know, sweetie, I'm sorry. Climb in and get your seatbelt on, okay? I need you to be a good girl and keep your sister quiet." A third hit slammed into the garage door, punctuating the end of Clay's sentence. The door buckled and sagged, but against Clay's earlier assessment, the garage door still held. Oh, I lost where I'm at. Cass scrambled into her seat, and once her legs were clear, Clay shut the door and hurriedly climbed into the car herself. Taya was not in agreement with the situation. While Clay sat herself in the front seat, all she could hear was Taya in the back, screaming for her daddy. Cass tried to get her little sister to be quiet, to calm down, but screaming, "Be quiet!" a bit just added to the chaos. Another crash coupled with a metallic ripping sound blasted through the garage, and the door finally crashed to the floor. Both of the girls fell silent. Clay looked over her shoulder and saw the silhouettes of 6 Estranged pouring through the breach against a backdrop of the setting sun peeking from above the house across the street. It was almost beautiful, but the circumstances cast the scene in a menacing light. Fen put the gear shift in reverse and hit the gas. The car bumped as it ran into their assailants and slowed as the tires tried to find traction on the remains of the garage door. In any other car, Calais would have been nervous, but she had faith in her 4-wheel drive. Fen gave it some more gas and the vehicle found its way over the obstacles. Clay flicked the safety off and turned to watch for the next wave of attackers. When the tires cleared the bodies of the first few, another dozen Estranged ran at them from the yard. They charged the car, punching and pounding and climbing onto the moving vehicle. Clay reflexively checked on the girls and found them staring at the windows like little statues, wide-eyed with fear. Clay felt her jaw clench as her hands tightened into fists. She cocked her gun and opened the sunroof. Clay was already climbing onto her seat, sticking her torso through the sunroof as they reached the end of the driveway. As she pulled her gun free of the car, she saw a middle-aged man push a young girl aside and jump onto the hood. His hair was long and thick, falling down his back in a big, greasy lump. The remnants of a checkered tie hung from his neck, and his slacks were ripped and shredded to the point that they could no longer reach his knees. Despite all that, he was the picture of health. Plenty of flesh on his arms and gut, plenty of strength in his legs, and despite a hunger in his eyes. Oh, and a desperate hunger in his eyes. On his chest, he had a few small tattoos hiding behind the erratic swing of his tie, but Clay didn't have time to figure out what they were. This man's bare hands were more dangerous than the weapon she held, and she wasn't about to let him near those girls. She lifted her gun as the man scrambled across the hood, reaching for Clay. His black-nailed fingers twitched with anticipation as they closed in on their target, the deep black of the nails gleaming from beneath the grime like obsidian. Seeing those nails sent a renewed wave of rage coursing through her body. She squeezed the trigger with a satisfied smirk. His head snapped back and his body tumbled off the moving car into the clawing arms of the dirt-smeared men and women who climbed up after him. Clay took them out one by one until the slide of her gun slid back and stayed there, out of ammo. But it didn't matter, only one Estranged remained. The teenage girl with her heavy, smeared makeup and her bedraggled brown ponytail didn't stand a chance as Fen switched into first gear and charged down the road. She lost her grip on the spoiler and fell away, hitting the pavement and rolling in a swirl of torn sweatshirt and jeans. Clay looked up as the girl's body slipped into the distance and spotted 3 more figures pulling onto the road in street-class motorcycles. Seriously? She returned to her seat and continued to watch the bikers in the side mirror. She knew they were estranged because all 3 bikers were helmetless, shirtless, even the one woman, and they were coming straight at the car with the kind of hell-bent determination that could only be from an estranged coming after a high. It didn't make any sense, but she pushed the questions from her mind and focused on what mattered. Opening the glove box, she stuck her hand inside where she found napkins, registry paperwork, and tire gauges, but, "Honey, where's my revolver?" I didn't want Taya to find it, so I put it back in the gun safe. Calais took a deep breath and pushed her palm into her forehead. Now was not the time to argue. This wasn't the end of the world. Instead, she stuck her hand back into the glove box and started rummaging again. Once more, she came up empty-handed. "Where are my spare magazines?" "In the house with the rest of the ammo. I cleaned the car last week, remember?" Clay threw her empty gun at the dashboard and yelled, "Well, it's a dang good thing I don't have any bullets because I could shoot you." Clay regretted the words the instant they came out of her mouth. The whimpering in the back seat grew a little louder as Fen grew silent. "I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have said that," but it was no use. The damage was done. She turned around and checked on the bikes. The Estranged were right on top of them now, just a couple feet behind the spoiler. No ammo, no weapons, just a car holding what little family she had left. She looked back at the girls and her heart broke as she watched the tears slide down their small faces. Cass protectively clutched her little sister as Taya quivered. Then heartbreak turned to determination as Calais steeled herself for the plan forming in her mind. Fen wouldn't like it, but it was the only way he could keep the girls safe. "Cass, Taya, Uncle Fen and I love you very, very much. You'll get to see your daddy soon. Uncle will take care of you." Calais' emotions threatened to overwhelm her, but she clenched her jaw and stuffed them back. "Everything is going to be okay, all right?" Cass nodded and grimaced as she squeezed a couple more tears out of her watery eyes. Clay turned to Fen. "Whatever happens, I need you to get them out of here." "What are you talking about? I need you to keep the girls safe. That's all that matters right now. Take them to the police station, call your brother, tell him what's happened. I'll meet you there. Clay, I love you." She gave him a kiss on the cheek and saw his anger soften as his confusion deepened. Balancing his attention between Clay and the road, Fen said, "I love you too, but honey, I don't understand what you're talking about. You and I are in this car together. We are going to the police station. We are going to call Kane." By this time, one of the motorcycles had pulled even with the car. It pained Clay to hear Fen say "we" when she knew she would be abandoning him. She mouthed one more "I love you" before opening the door and slamming it into the nearest bike. The motorcyclist wobbled and quickly lost control, his machine crashing into the blur of pavement. Without looking back, she jumped after it. A practiced tuck and roll protected Clay from the worst of the fall. That and the very healthy bush she crashed into. For once, Clay appreciated her neighborhood's obsessive attention to gardening. The Estranged, on the other hand, was worse off. His neck and head lay at an awkward angle to the rest of his body, and the front of his skull was crashed in. She looked back over her shoulder to see the blue car disappear as it took a right at the end of the street. She was relieved. Her biggest concern was that Fen would try to come back and talk her out of it while the remaining Estranged closed in on them, but he had listened to her. Only for the girl's sake, she was sure. The next part was a gamble. 2 bikes. Would they turn back or would they continue their pursuit? Clay wasn't sure she could catch up with them if they continued after Fen, but luckily she didn't have to test that theory because the Estranged dropped their speed for a moment and doubled back for her. Typical predators. She was hoping they would go after the easier target. Now it was just a matter of eluding them. Clay sprinted over to the downed bike and extracted it from the dead man's grasp, carefully avoiding his exposed skin. He might be dead, but she was still wary of him. Once the bike was erect, Clay threw her leg over it, kicked it into life, and took off just as the others started to catch speed again. The thrill of speeding across the pavement on 2 wheels poured a new surge of adrenaline into her veins, along with a vibrant sense of optimism. Not only were Fen and the girls going to be all right, but this might be fun. Blondie was still MIA, though. He wasn't standing in any yards, he wasn't riding either of the bikes, he wasn't following in any car. His absence didn't sit well with Calais, but she pushed it out of her mind as she tried to put more distance between herself and the last two estranged. She twisted the throttle, but instead of gaining power, she started losing it. The bike began to slowly die beneath her. Her optimism quickly faded to dread as she looked down and saw that the entire left side was demolished. The plastic and metal framework was so twisted and torn that she was surprised the bike was still functional. Crap. She looked back at the other bikers and assessed the situation. They were gaining on her. Side by side, elbow to elbow, they rode straight at her. Clay looked forward, formulated a new plan, and prepared to act. Without warning, she dropped one foot to the ground, whipped the motorcycle around, and released it. The momentum pushed Clay off balance, causing her to fall backwards, yet the new plan had worked. The bike crashed into the ground and skidded across the pavement, straight for the estranged. With no time to react, the bikers slammed into it and were thrown violently into the air. Clay first watched with triumph, then alarm, then horror as one of the bodies flew right at her. She scrambled backwards as fast as she could, then dropped onto her back as she realized the estranged woman's momentum was going to carry her over Clay, not into her. But it wasn't enough. The woman's bare, flailing arm brushed against Clay's exposed knee as she sailed over. Pain ripped through every cell in Clay's body. And that's where I'm gonna leave it.